In this video, I will be discussing the veteran, activist, and convicted criminal Okuzaki Kenzo. Infamous for his extreme methods of information extraction, as well as his fixed impression of Japanese society. Okuzaki is most well known for his representation in the documentary The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On.
だですね。だから訪ねてきたらね、挨拶してどうだ貴様。来いこちらへ。
For Okuzaki, the saying, "Violence is never the answer," is nothing but a platitude meant for little school children. At the ripe age of 21, he was drafted into the engineering corps of the Japanese Army and sent to China, where he spent 3 months training. Over the next 2 years, after encountering a few unexpected victories in the Asia-Pacific War, the Japanese war leaders decided to expand their conquest. Okuzaki, as well as his fellow comrades in the engineering corps, were all transferred from China to the island of New Guinea. While in New Guinea, they were assigned with the task of capturing 3 separate areas for the purpose of setting up bases. However, this plan was developed by the Imperial headquarters in Tokyo. The war leaders there were using their experience from China and trying to adapt it onto the island of New Guinea. However, that experience couldn't translate. While in China, the terrain was flat and mostly empty, compared to the likes of New Guinea, which was mountainous and full of dense jungle. This made it extremely difficult to traverse the terrain. The Australians and the Americans, on the other hand, had performed extensive scouting on the island's topography beforehand. They opted wisely for aerial and nautical positions, only sending boots on the ground when absolutely necessary. They used the leapfrog method to jump from base to base. In doing so, they were able to drive the Japanese up to the northeast coast of the island. Many Japanese troops found themselves caught between the bases and the jungle, which was being bombarded. Eventually, these troops found themselves hiding and starving in the jungle. Out of the 148,000 soldiers that were mobilized for the New Guinea campaign, only 13,000 survived. Okuzaki's troop was hit particularly hard. While walking the jungle one day, they were ambushed by Allied troops, who rained bullets upon them. Okuzaki was unfortunately hit in the thighs and the hand, losing his pinky finger. Yet, he still managed to escape. He spent the next few days walking the jungle alone, before coming to the conclusion that he was not fit to survive. He surrendered himself to death by Allied bullets, and gave himself up. But instead, they took him in as a prisoner of war, and he was shipped to an Australian camp where he spent the rest of his time until the war ended. Out of the 1,200 men in Okuzaki's 36th Engineering Corps, he was only one of 6 to survive. It was Okuzaki's time in New Guinea that would shape the remainder of his life. New Guinea would so occupy his mind that even 40 years later, his passion had not faltered at all, and he still sought out justice for the victims of crimes that were never accounted for. This is largely the plot of Kazuo Hara's The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On, which is the documentary I've been pulling footage from. This documentary is also where I was first introduced to Okuzaki. It's a straightforward piece where Hara, who also acts as the camera operator, follows Okuzaki over the course of several years as he tries to track down and uncover the truth behind the death of 2 soldiers in the New Guinea campaign.
In
the documentary, Okuzaki comes across as passionate, determined, politically active, but also aggressive and obsessive. He does not shy away from force and violence while interviewing his subjects, all of which are veterans themselves from the New Guinea campaign. In fact, at times it appears to be his preferred method of communication, believing that people will often twist and stretch the truth when confronted with something uneasy. The way these interviews are typically conducted is by Okuzaki showing up either unannounced or merely by a brief phone call a few hours or the day before arrival. He would come with a camera operator, Hara, a sound mixer, and as well as a lighting crew.
いやですから申し訳ありません。ですからもう大変ね。
He would proceed to introduce himself and immediately start asking the interviewee some tough questions, which dig up a past that they are all, presumably, trying to forget. Nevertheless, Okuzaki does state his intentions clearly and informs them that he's willing to use violence to get the truth out of them, which he does. After bouncing from interview to interview, the truth eventually does come out. It takes years of Okuzaki's life and great effort, often coming back to a subject's house to re-interview them once a new piece of information elucidates a hidden truth. And the story of the two fallen soldiers ultimately is banal and sad. They were executed 23 days after the war had ended. They simply weren't complicit with the Japanese soldiers resorting to cannibalism. And they tried to flee. Well, the leaders and soldiers there didn't like that and lined the two up and shot them. What's striking about the film isn't the story that it uncovers. It is surprising, but it isn't necessarily unlike any other stories of war that you've likely heard. No, what's interesting about the film is the passion and rage that you see deep within the eyes of Okuzaki Kenzo. Despite his tough exterior, it's impossible not to empathize with Okuzaki. In fact, you're only left to wonder at what kind of past someone has to go through in order to believe so deeply in a cause that ultimately ends in futility and reveals nothing. Shortly after the war ended, Okuzaki killed a man. The man he killed was apparently a scheming property broker who reportedly worked for the Yakuza, or at least had ties to them. Okuzaki handed him the money for a property, and the broker ran away. In return, Okuzaki stabbed him to death. He frequently references the 10 years he spent in prison in the movie. In fact, he's proud of it.
3年9ヶ月送ってきました私にとってはへのかっぱであります。俺が責任取る。
But what the film omits is what Okuzaki spent those 10 years thinking about. He read voraciously and formed his own theories about Japan. But at the back of his mind, he still could not escape New Guinea, and the man responsible for it, Hirohito. The Emperor Hirohito, the man most responsible for the war, was still at large. He was still emperor. To Okuzaki, that was a deep contradiction that he could not wrap his head around. In fact, not only was he free at large, but he was admired by most of the Japanese people. He wrote that the position of the emperor, in and of itself, was in contradiction to the new constitution erected in 1946. Hirohito ultimately became Okuzaki's villain. And in fact, in the 10 years he spent in prison, he sent in 6 appeals trying to hold Hirohito responsible for the deaths of Japanese soldiers during the war. He also attempted to abolish the emperor system altogether, both of which failed. And like I mentioned, on January 2nd, 1969, at the public opening of the Imperial Gardens, Okuzaki shot at the emperor, using pachinko balls and a slingshot from roughly 75 feet away. He screamed into the crowd, "Yamazaki, shoot the emperor with a pistol!" Yamazaki was one of his fallen comrades from New Guinea. He said this line, of course, to draw more attention to himself, making sure to include the word pistol, as he thought this would definitely draw attention from the police. But no police came. And disappointed, Okuzaki had to confront the police himself, tell them of what he did, and ask to be arrested. Despite none of the balls coming into contact with Emperor Hirohito, from that moment on, he addressed the crowd behind panes of glass. The following day, every Japanese newspaper outlet reported on the incident. However, all but one of them claimed that Okuzaki was a paranoid, dementia-suffering, crazy person. They also mentioned his criminal record of having murdered a real estate broker. All but one of them failed to mention that he is a veteran from the New Guinea campaign. Okuzaki fought to go to trial. To this day, his is the only case to personally involve the emperor under the new constitution. This new constitution abolished the law of lèse majestés, which is a general term, but in Japan it was used to prosecute crimes against royalty or divinity. The abolition of this law, as well as the new constitution, theoretically meant that any man or woman or person had as many rights in the court as did any other person, including the emperor. But the prosecutors accused Okuzaki committing a crime of assault against the emperor. Now, a crime of assault is legally described as a crime against a natural person, which, in that case, would imply Emperor Hirohito is a natural person. If he wasn't considered to be that way, it would be a violation of Article 14 of Japan's new constitution, which states, "All of the people are equal under the law, and there shall be no discrimination in political, economic, or social relations because of race, creed, sex, social status, or family of origin." Yet, in the indictment, the emperor's name is not used once. Instead, they only refer to him as the emperor. In other words, the emperor was considered an entity and not necessarily a natural person. Imagine for a moment the President of the United States is involved in a court case. And yet in that court case, not once do they ever mention his legal name. Instead, throughout the entire transcript, it is only stated as the President, the President, the President. It was still the custom to refer to the emperor as the emperor in Japan, whether it be in news articles, magazines. However, Okuzaki and his lawyer were adamant that the victim must be clearly identified as an individual in order to clarify the nature of the crime. The judge was sympathetic with their case and advised the prosecutor to follow suit. However, the prosecutor refused to take the judge's advice, stating that it would be taboo. They said there is no need to clarify his name, as everyone knows who he is. The prosecutor also presented no testimony from the victim, as well as no evidence at all. Unexpectedly, Okuzaki fired his lawyer, and the cross-referencing of Hirohito, as well as any other possible victims, was canceled. And so the trial was conducted without identifying the victim, hearing the victim's testimony, or cross-examining any of the witnesses that the perpetrator requested. Essentially, it was an unconstitutional trial, one that violated the new constitution and appeared to be simply a punishment of Okuzaki by nature of lèse-majesté. In response, Okuzaki wrote this letter to the judges. "Both the prosecutors and judges who indicated or sentenced me at the first and second trials respect the person whom they regard as a victim of the case in question as the emperor. However, according to the preamble of the Constitution, we reject and revoke all constitutions, laws, ordinances, and rescripts in conflict with the universal principle of mankind. It is our clear, common understanding that the existence of the emperor is in conflict with the universal principle of mankind. The emperor's authority, value, legitimacy, and life are only temporary, partial, relative, and subjective. Therefore, the fundamental nature of the emperor is absolutely, objectively, entirely, and permanently depraved. Hence, Articles 1 to 8 of the current Constitution, which endorse the existence of the emperor, are definitely invalid. For a person with normal discernment and mind, those articles are nonsensical, obsolete, and foolish." The judges, once again, dismissed the letter. And thus, all of Okuzaki's formal attempts at trying to make change and hold Hirohito responsible failed. They all failed. Roughly 30 years after the war had ended and nothing had been done, Okuzaki had only spent several years of his life in prison, had become tormented with guilt, with regret, and with anger. Those are the kinds of things that lead to the man you see when you watch The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On. And when I first watched it, parts of it were honestly comedic to me. I found it strange that someone could behave this way in front of others. But the more I learned about him, the more I felt for him. It's remarkable that someone so beaten down, so ostracized, and so alienated from his own society could still keep going. He remained impassioned till the very end, and for that, he is admirable. But, in fact, at the very end, it is likely his passion that broke him. He'd become so consumed by his own righteousness that he failed to see beyond his own direct experience. Through all of his writings, appearances in publics, or statements in the film, Okuzaki never mentions once the atrocities and horrors committed by the Japanese towards the Chinese, or Koreans, or any others during the Asia-Pacific War. And he never really remarked on the horrors of war as an idea, or a global sentiment. Instead, what he talked about was always his own internalized experience. And for his own acts of violence, he never took responsibility for himself. To me, he was so consumed by his own experience that he was never able to evolve his ideas past them. Till the very end, it seemed that he was caught in the jungle, trying to survive, trying to get out. But at the same time, it's difficult to blame him. I certainly haven't gone through an ounce of what he had. And as I mentioned before, when you watch the documentary, you see profound humanity in his eyes. Despite his violent and emotional outbursts and speeches, you see someone who was called upon his country only to be abandoned on it the moment he returned. You see someone ostracized for his experience, despite trying to make right for the collective national pain felt by Japan post-war. You see a country that's indifferent, with national amnesia. You see Okuzaki Kenzo.
戦争中にね、3人の同期2人で兵隊を殺したわけですよ。ね、いろいろして最終的に注意殴り倒したりして、でそのおかげで生きて帰れたわけですけども。ですから私にとっては元中隊長の小清水を現在に殴り倒すということはへでもないわけですね。そうです。
Okay, that is finished. Okuzaki Kenzo is a controversial figure. I highly recommend anyone check out the film. And most importantly, I think you should check out this article that I found in I believe it's called the Asia Pacific Journal. Most of the information that I gathered and spouted out to you was pretty much information that I found from this article, as well as a few other articles like the New York Times, did a few reviews on the film, and other things that I left. All my sources I will link in the description. Highly recommend you check them out. Highly recommend you watch the film and formulate your own opinion, because he is a controversial figure, a very strong figure with strong ideas. And so I don't think you should watch this video and worship him necessarily. That is not the right thing to do. He's a lot. But he's someone still who is a human like you and I, with profound humanity and profound care, who was just unfortunately bombarded with horrible life circumstances. Here are this film's stats. Yo, also, so I'm editing right now, and I realize, maybe I'm not the biggest World War II, Japan, Asia-Pacific War expert in the world, so if I got anything wrong, or some information was fully correct, just let me know down in the comments. Comment down below. I know there's those World War II experts out there. So yeah. Subscribe.